Dyo Shantirantariksham Shanti Prithvi Shanti Apasyantiroshadhaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shantir Vishve Devas Shantir Brahma Shanti Sarvam Shanti Shantireva Shanti Sama Shantiredhi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Let there be peace in heaven, on earth, in the sky, and in all life, everywhere, in our hearts and in the whole creation. Om peace, peace, peace. This morning our subject is spiritual common sense and managing our everyday life. Now the question is, what is spiritual common sense? Now common sense itself, as most of us know, is a very uncommon thing in the world. So it is totally different from intellectual brilliance, scholarship, different skills, different faculties, because we frequently find that many great scholars, thinkers, artists, musicians, men and women of great accomplishments, they are not found to be examples of common sense. On the other hand, we also find in history certain people, they succeed in many things, in many areas of work, without what we normally understand as conventional language, intellectual brilliance or scholarship. So in many ways, common sense itself is something very valuable, very important, and at the same time very rare. Scholarship and brilliance, abilities to achieve great things, efficiency, all these may be much more common than what we normally understand, a mental balancing mechanism, which is what common sense is all about. An ability to see things as they are. So common sense is defined in a very surprising language in the Mahabharata. The ability to see the limitation of everything. So that is the definition of common sense. In a way, it is true. When we think of the limit of something, it means we are aware where it ends. On the one hand, we have got all the best in terms of material success. On the other hand, we also have a clear understanding of where it ends, its limitation. So the ability to understand the limitation of something is very, very important in life. It is this ability to understand a limitation where it is no more relevant, where it cannot move further. It is this faculty that translates into a mental balancing mechanism. So you can find this among sometimes some village elders, in some old grandmothers, grandparents, people who cannot boast of high intellectual accomplishments. You can find this. So what does it mean? It is a balancing mechanism. I cannot give a better example as a student of Vedanta. I cannot think of a better example than the definition of an ideal king endowed with a sense of spiritual common sense, as mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita and also in the commentaries written in Sanskrit. So if I quote Sanskrit verses, please don't mind, I shall translate, expand, and if you completely ignore the Sanskrit quotations, you won't be missing anything. In the Bhagavad Gita, one particular word is used. It is called Rajarshi. So, Rajarshi means a philosopher who is also a king, which means, a king cannot sit in a forest hermitage. He has to be active. He has to be more active, more efficient, more empirically successful than a modern CEO, because he has to handle so many executive powers, judiciary powers, legislative powers. All these were actually concentrated on a single individual in the ancient monarchies. So he has to be very, very intelligent to be an ideal king. So he has to be a philosopher, which we know Plato says philosopher king. Plato said Rishi Raja. Sanskrit says Rajarshi, the same thing. Philosopher king, philosopher is a sage, a saint. In fact, that real definition of a sage, a philosopher in Vedanta is drashta, or means somebody who sees far into things and deep into things, can also have a clear understanding from both sides. That's what it means. When you see something, when you experience something, when you face a situation, to have complete comprehensive understanding, a perception of what that actually implies. This requires something much more profound than intellectual understanding. Frequently, intellectual training, academic training, blunts our natural native faculty to use common sense. That's one problem with modern education. Modern education actually pulls us through a tube, puts us in a mold. So what happens, many of the higher faculties that the human mind inherently possesses are atrophied due to constant misuse or non-use. That's what modern education very frequently does. I'm not all kinds of education. It's an education system which is not ideal. No, Plato used the word philosopher king, which in Sanskrit would mean Rishi Raja. Sage comes first, then the king. And Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita uses sage philosopher. So that's the only meaning. Or king philosopher. Now, the Sanskrit commentaries give a very beautiful analysis of what this actually means, which you don't find in the Republic of Plato. So, there is a great commentator who wrote a well-known Tika. Tika is a very short, it's like a notes, descriptive notes, not going very deep, on a book. This is called a Tika. Now, Shankarananda Saraswati was a great saint, a sage and a monk, who wrote a commentary on the Gita. So he interprets this unique spiritual common sense that every ideal man of action should possess. So king is a man of action. He has to do a lot of work. He has to get a lot of work done by others. He has to face challenges and he has to succeed. He is fighting with his back to the wall. So what all qualities you should possess in the field of administration? So he says, Rajatvam Aishwarya Sambatti Rishitvam Tasyaha Sukshmartha Darshana Kshamatvam. This is a great definition given by Shankarananda Saraswati. Rajatvam, Aishwarya Sambatti, Rishitvam, Tasyaha, Sukshmartha, Darsana, Kshamatvam. What it says is, the status, the position of a king corresponds to huge wealth, success, opulence, efficiency, dynamism, enthusiasm, professionalism, all these qualities. Because, as I mentioned, ancient monarchs combined in their hands both the legislature, the judiciary, and also the executive. So that was what a king was supposed to be. He is the final arbitrator, and he should be the one who decides on different matters, and he's also the chief executive. Now, he naturally possesses a lot of wealth, efficiency, many armies, many people working under him. Now, when he becomes a king endowed with the spiritual common sense, then he acquires another important quality, Rishitvam. What is Rishitvam? The ability to understand the limitation, the transience of all these executive, legislative, and judiciary powers, even while handling these powers, even when you are engaged in constant action and your duties and responsibilities, still you should know that there is something beyond that. And you understand that there is something beyond that only when you know where it ends, its limit. It is this ability to understand the limit of everything that gives an innate sense of common sense. You find people worrying so much, lot of anxiety, lot of problems, sometimes imaginary problems and challenges, often imaginary problems. And that's all because we consider the position of a king as the only thing that exists. And we completely exclude the value of being a philosopher. So Vedanta divides the whole world of reality into two categories. One is the empirical, the relative, the non-eternal, the changing, the transient, and the changeable, which Vedanta calls, what you experience in everyday life. What all problems we handle in our everyday life. How we manage our everyday life. So this everyday life, with all its challenges and possibilities and problems, are included in this category of the relative, the empirical, the changing. It's called Vyavaharika. Vyavahara itself means managing everyday life. That's Vyavahara. Sanskrit word is very, very, very interesting. Every root, if you trace the meaning of the root, you will get the whole meaning of it, the loaded meaning. That's a uniqueness of Sanskrit. That's why Sanskrit language is not language, it is a philosophy. So the first book on grammatical philosophy is Bhartrhari's Vakyapadiya, which was written in the 1st century AD, the same century in which Jesus was born and crucified. The same century produced the first and most ancient book on grammatical philosophy, or interpreting language and grammar as a philosophy. It's called Vakyapadiya, Bhartrhari's book. So, the everyday life, with all its problems and challenges, on the one hand, and the ability to understand that there is something beyond that. There is something beyond what we see with our eyes. There is something beyond that today. There is something beyond the empirical, the visible, the tangible. Once you understand that, you can live in this world and manage everyday life in a very intelligent manner. Even while facing a very big problem, you will remember this very big problem won't be there tomorrow, and it was not there yesterday. A big situation, a big challenging situation, very unpleasant, unhappy situation, that also is going to be different, which means it will be less unpleasant. So, and this is the other side, the negative side. The positive side is the happy situation also will change. So we are able to manage a very happy situation without being overjoyed, without going crazy over our success and wealth and power, without being too proud of it, without losing our real home ground, without losing our balance. We are able to enjoy, appreciate, understand a happy, pleasant situation. We won't lose our mind. We won't lose our balance. So also, when we face an unpleasant situation, then also we are able to remember that this unpleasant situation is also changeable. All belong to time, space, and causation. It is called everyday life, vyavaharika satta, the relative entity. Now, to be a philosopher, you should not only know the limitation of the empirical, you should also have a clear understanding of the transcendental. In modern times, one of the biggest problems we are facing in modern times is the tyranny of utilitarianism, and that is aligned to a kind of moral relativism. This moral relativism is a very slippery ground. Very often that is used as a tool to justify utilitarianism and what we call ultra-pragmatism. I think part of the blame should go to Kant. Because when Kant evolved his categorical impurity, a supreme moral principle, he linked it to a sense of duty. So the morality or immorality, the righteousness of its opposite, of any action can be partly justified on the ground whether it actually fulfills our sense of duty or not. Now, when we talk about philosopher king from Plato or Rajarshi from Bhagavad Gita, we had also to refer to the greatest name in modern Western philosophy, Kant. So maybe Kant is partly responsible for the legacy of ultra-pragmatism and a kind of enlightened utilitarianism, much more enlightened than J.S. Mill or Jeremy Bentham could have thought of, a kind of moral relativism. When you do certain things, if it is necessary to do your duty to the nation state, then it can be justified. Now, duty, it can be a terrible dictator and a torment. To be a philosopher, you should be able to look beyond duty. Because very often, a sense of duty can often lead us to the pit of ultra-pragmatism and utilitarianism. And that is the beginning of this eternal blind pursuit of happiness, and the irony and tragedy and the paradox of that happiness ever eluding us. If you look at the whole purpose of human existence in modern times, whatever we may call, whatever new justifications we may invent to justify, there is no doubt that the pursuit of empirical happiness in everyday life is the one supreme goal of all modern scientific and technological discoveries. They may have another possibility, but all these skills, these gifts in the form of power and comfort that we got from nature by pursuing this path of scientific and technological discoveries was an increased volume of happiness. An increased volume of happiness in terms of sensual pleasures, empirical pleasures. To be a philosopher, in the true sense of the term, you should not only know how to generate wealth, which is necessary for happiness, but should also know where it ends, where it ought to end. In fact, Vedanta divides the whole concept of reality into Vyavaharika and Paramarthika. Vyavaharika means the empirical, the changing, the transient, and Paramarthika means the transcendental. To be able to enjoy this world, to be able to make sense of this world, empirical world, you should have a transcendental link. So the first verse in the Ishavasyopanisha, Vasimidam Sarvam Yat Kinja Jagatyan Jagat Tena Tyaktena Bunjithaha Magdaka Sisudhanam. That's the first verse. Kurvanneva Hekarmani Jivi Shatam Samaha Evam Tuin Anyade Dosti Na Karma Lippede Nare. These are the two verses I shall try to explain. The first statement is, there is one transcendental, omnipresent, immanent reality, the transcendental reality, that goes beyond everyday life, that goes beyond the empirical, the changing world of sensory pleasures and enjoyments. That is one supreme reality. And then after fully being convinced of the existence of this transcendental reality, you live in this empirical world. But you should remember that, because an understanding, at least an intellectual conviction of this transcendental reality, gives us an instinctive understanding of the limitation of the empirical material pleasures, enjoyments. If we think that material pleasure is the only purpose, ultra-pragmatism, utilitarianism or relativism are the only guiding principles, as I mentioned earlier, or even Kantian concept of duty, which is totally devoid of any spiritual content. That's the main problem with Kant. Duty, Kantian duty, critique of practical reason, it is built on the solid foundation of the principle that the ultimate value is this categorical imperative, which is a moral, universal, supreme principle, and it translates into a kind of perfectionism built on duty consciousness. Now, that again belongs to the relative, the empirical. It is also devoid of the transcendental value. Vedanta gives you this idea. Succeed as much as you want. Be an emperor. That's why Rajarshi, he's a king actually. As I mentioned earlier, the ancient monarchs, they combined in their hands the executive, the legislative, and also the judiciary powers. So it's a concentration of dictatorial powers. Like that, if a modern man wants to generate trillions of dollars, has the ambition to become the most powerful executive in the world, has the biggest home, the biggest bank account, and the largest number of retinue, sycophants and followers, still if he can and is able to remember that all these things will disappear one day, then he gets spiritual common sense. So the understanding that there is something beyond this, these things do not constitute the whole of human life, then the spiritual common sense will begin to manifest in our life. That's why Kalidasa had a very unpleasant reminder of a bitter truth. But it is a classic example of spiritual wisdom in 4 lines. He says, Yavvanam dhana sambatti prabhuttam avivekida ekaikamabi anarthaya kimuyatra sadushtayam. What he says is, a person is young, lot of money and wealth, and he is a very powerful person, he has a lot of followers around him, and he has no spiritual common sense. Now each of these factors can lead him straight to his downfall. Ekaikamapi anarthaya. Each one of these single-handedly can lead him to his downfall. But what happens when all of them combine together? That's a problem of what I mentioned earlier, this cult of utilitarianism and the cult of subjugating everything to the concept of duty. So, there we understand the value of Vedanta, because Vedanta tells you, live in the world, as I mentioned, Ishavasya Upanishad. Live in the world, that's why, tena tyaktena bunjita means you enjoy this world. The next line also, this kurvanneva iha karmani jivishe shatam samaha. Develop this aspiration, this ambition to live in the world for 100 years. Shatam samaha, 100 years. Kurvanneva. Work for 15 hours every day in the workplace, in the office, the factory, the university. 15 hours you can work and live for 100 years. But remember, there is one all-pervading supreme reality. Once we remind ourselves of this transcendental reality, then what happens? We will be able to enjoy this world through the tool of renunciation. So renunciation becomes the tool of enjoyment. It may look a bit paradoxical. What is meant by renunciation? Renunciation is the wisdom that comes to our mind. Well, I have all this money in the bank. So if I lose the money, I should not lose sleep, because money is meant to be lost. Money is not meant to remain there for billions of years the same manner. These computer figures, digits will change. You can't remain constant. So the world is changing, our body is changing. Everything that we value, consider as the most precious in this life, in this world, is subject to change, inevitable. We know this, but what happens when we face a problem, either when we lose the money and wealth, or when we get a big promotion? On both the occasions, in a very unpleasant situation and in a very happy situation. In both these situations, what happens? We forget this. That's why intellectual convictions, intellectual understanding doesn't necessarily translate into common sense. I mentioned earlier, the most brilliant scholar may be the stupidest person in understanding the essence of life as a whole. If we could always translate what we know into common sense, if we can bring what we know into our mind, into our attitudes, then there will be no problem in the world. Absolutely there will be no problem. But then we don't always remember. So Vedanta tells us that the limitation of this world and the reality of something beyond this world, Once we understand and remember this, then it acts as a inner guide. Mind itself becomes a great friend. Mind becomes a great tormentor when mind is allowed to live only in the empirical relative plane we call everyday life. So everyday life can be managed when we remember that every day is every new day every day. That means it is changing, it is not the same. So this is the essence of spiritual common sense. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what are the enemies of spiritual common sense? I already mentioned earlier that very often we are not able to remember, we are not able to make use of what we know intellectually in our everyday life. So Vedanta Scriptures recommends one very interesting tool to make use of what we know and how to translate what we know into spiritual common sense. And that concept is called Swadharma. So managing everyday life is an important subject before us. So how do we look upon our duty, our work, and our own role in that work? You know, whatever we do will have some influence in our character. Whatever we do, any kind of physical, intellectual, or verbal action, a thought in the mind, a word we speak, a physical act that we do, all these will leave behind a residual effect, a result, which gets accumulated in the mental system, and that particular phenomenon is called in the language of Vedanta and Yoga called vritti. We cannot consciously do something wrong without that action leaving something, a very unpleasant influence in the mental system. We may repeat what we have done, that possibility is always there. So it becomes a samskara, a tendency, an impression. And it becomes an attitude towards work called sankalpa. And we may repeat this again and again. So it is a fact that we cannot do anything without our mind being affected by what we do. At the same time, it is impossible for any human being to keep quiet, doing nothing, even for a split second. Physically, we may be able to remain inactive. We may be sitting in an easy chair without doing any visible work. But even at that time, our mind will be hyperactive. Mind will be thinking, dreaming, expecting, thinking of many possibilities in future. So mind could be hyperactive even when the body is totally inactive. That's why Lord Krishna says, Nahi kasikshanam abhi jadu tishtati akarma karta karidehi avashak karma sarva pragudijaihi gunaihi. What it means is, even for a split second, we do not and we cannot remain inactive mentally and physically. Impossible. If a body is not active, mind will be hyperactive. So if you do not make any conscious effort to do something positive, then there will be a natural tendency of the mind to turn to something which may not be positive, which may not be helpful. So a constant effort to divert our mind and senses into creative channels is necessary, not only to do something creative, but also to prevent our mind and senses from doing something which could eventually be harmful or destructive. Because mind never remains quiet. That's why Lord Krishna says, even when you don't make an effort, you'll be totally helpless. Mind will naturally flow itself into all these sense objects through the 5 senses of perception. The eyes, the ears, the tongue, the taste, and the sense of touch. All these are 5 channels through which mind constantly keeps flowing to its sense objects. So, it is impossible to keep quiet. It is impossible to remain doing nothing. At the same time, there is always a problem that actions produce results which may not always be helpful or may not always be eventually happy. So how to get out of this? For that we should evolve an attitude, the attitude of a philosopher towards life as a whole. And life as a whole means towards what we do, towards duty. So what philosophical attitude we should have, we should assume towards this concept of duty? It is portrayed in the Gita. It's called Swadharma. What is Swadharma? So, if there's a verbal dictionary meaning will be very, very inadequate, naturally. What Swadharma means? Something that we do by virtue of our fitness to do, our qualification to do, our status in society, a position in the family, or our pursuit of happiness, our means for making both ends meet, as a means for earning our daily bread. All these are different compulsions when we take up a work. A position in family, in society, in the country, in a bureaucratic hierarchy, or our own nature, our own qualification, our own training, our preparedness. All these are different criteria in deciding what we must do and how we must do. And these things may change from stage to stage. But one universal approach is possible towards everything that we do or we did not do. It's called Swadharma, means I am doing this by virtue of my duty, my way of earning my bread, and my own qualification or fitness or preparedness. That's what I'm going to do. So a doctor, for example, his duty obvious. A doctor may be interested in music, art, or drawing, but drawing doesn't become his Swadharma when there's a patient knocking at the door. So also an engineer, an artist, whoever may be. So once we approach our duty with this idea, this is my way of justifying my existence. A duty that comes to us unasked, without our going in search of it. That is, in the simplest possible language, Swadharma. So dharma here means it is not unrelated to the Buddhist concept of dharma. Dharma is a regulatory, ethical, moral, spiritual philosophy of righteousness which keeps the world in a state of equilibrium. So how we do things in a way that does not upset the equilibrium of the cosmic existence. That is duty. And no, something that comes to us by virtue of our need and demands in society or family or our own preparation, that is called Swadharma. Once we do whatever we do as Swadharma, then you don't have to ponder over, but why did I do that? I could have done it better. There is no need. We may do that in order to improve what we do, but it doesn't create any pain or anxiety, disappointment or depression. In fact, that is the uniqueness of Swadharma. Once we do or whatever we do with this self-fulfilling attitude, then you will have no reason to look back, oh, I should not have done it the way I did. Or I should have done it differently. Because when we are true to ourselves, and when we do what we do with this attitude, then along with that action, our mind gets spiritually enriched. And that enrichment expresses in the form of, well, I have done what I should have done. I have achieved what I should have achieved. This is the most precious thing that modern man is pursuing. People take to drinks, alcohol and drugs and into all kinds of things. Many of the aberrations that we find in society, especially in schools, in the student community, are because we are not able to present something before them beyond a machine, beyond a training that could help them to make little more money. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the tyranny of utilitarianism and moral relativism. Sometimes the tendency to justify everything in the context of its immediate situation is a moral slippery ground that's called moral relativism. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, I am not advocating a kind of moral absolutism, because that could lead to some kind of fanatical, dogmatic interpretation of life as a whole. Moral relativism is actually a natural intellectual response to the tyranny of moral absolutism. What I mean to say is, the concept of Swadharma, it includes in it the virtues of all these. And it takes us far beyond Kantian concept of duty. Kant laid out a very wonderful principle. So we had the North European countries, Protestant countries, developing so fast, directly or indirectly, thanks to Kantian influence of perfectionism and duty and work. But it left behind a huge gaping hole, a spiritual vacuum. So we had all those the Prussian War in 1870, and then we had, I don't want to go into those unpleasant chapters of modern European history. So what I mean to say, Vedanta gives something more than what Kant gave and enriches what he said. Along with doing our duty, which supports this categorical impurity of supreme moral principle, it also becomes a tool for our own spiritual evolution. Once we do what we do as our Swadharma, as our way of justifying our existence, spiritually justifying our existence, then what happens? We get this kritarthada, this inner fulfillment. And that takes us one step forward in our own spiritual evolution. So every action becomes so many miles covered in our journey to our own spiritual fulfillment. So every action can have and does have a spiritual element in it. Of course, in modern times, Vivekananda interpreted the Swadharma and Karma Yoga as practical Vedanta in modern times. But in the context of 21st century, we are facing these demons of utilitarianism, and what we call techno-pragmatism is a very wonderful, high-sounding word, but highly deceptive and has the face of a monster. Everything is okay. Every tool, every gift from nature that we get through science and technology becomes an instrument for adding a few more extra dollars into the coffer. And it eventually lengthens the hours of sleepless nights, of course. Because, as I mentioned, success in life is not success if a person is not able to enjoy that success. In the process of acquiring the means and tools for enjoyment, one may be left intellectually and psychologically wrecked, incapable of making use of or enjoying anything that is built up over decades of hard work. So that's why this concept of linking ourselves to the transcendental. On the one hand, we should know all these things are necessary. Duty is necessary. Work is necessary. Efficiency is necessary. And enthusiasm, plan, and the explosive developments in science and technology are all necessary. But they do have a limit beyond which they cannot go. So understanding this limit, which I repeated again and again in the early part of this lecture, understanding the limit of where it ends, that is what actually spiritual common sense. Once we know that they do have a limit, we'll be looking for something beyond that. And when we look beyond that, then we understand there is something transcendental, that there is one divine reality present everywhere. And our way of interacting with this divine reality is the practice of swadharma. Means every action, every word, every thought can be translated into the swadharma. It doesn't leave a painful heart. It doesn't leave a depressed mind behind. It doesn't lead to tears and pains and sorrows and suicides and depression and lunatic asylums. Rather, it gives us a sense of inner fulfillment. That is the uniqueness of a spiritual value as the manager of our everyday life. The understanding of the limitation of all the tools we have acquired in managing everyday life at the empirical level. The recognition that they do have a limit. There are areas where they cannot serve. There are areas where the empirical values, science and technology, efficiency and workaholism cannot give us anything. That's why Ishavasya Upanishad says, Ishavasya idam sarvam. First, the Upanishad tells you this divine reality is all-pervading. And that is the only eternal, immortal, everlasting, unchanging reality. Everything else belongs to the changing, the relative, the empirical realm. Know this, and then you work hard. And then we will be able to enjoy this world by renouncing it. How do we renounce when we enjoy? Renouncing attachment, renouncing the wrong notion that this is the only thing to be achieved, this is the only thing to be aimed at. That ambition, that wrong notion to be renounced when we are convinced of a transcendental possibility. And that's why in the next part, the Upanishad tells you, then you work hard, live 100 years in the world, acquire a lot of wealth and money, and it is mentioned like in the ancient monarchs who combine in their hands both the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. All right, but remember, there is a day when these things will come to an end. And that day you will realize there is something that never comes to an end. And that should be what you should be aspiring for. Keep that in mind and live in the world. And then you will be able to manage this world more intelligently. So I shall conclude again by repeating what I mentioned maybe last year in one of the sessions. And there was the greatest author in the Hindu tradition is Vyasa. Now, this man was a very interesting person. He is the one who edited the whole Vedas into 4 branches, and he taught each of these 4 branches to 4 of his disciples. And he wrote the biggest book in the world, Mahabharata, which contains 145,000 verses, the larger version. And the version that's now current, popular these days, more than 100,000 verses. And he has written innumerable books, so many books. And he was the most accomplished scholar and philosopher of his time. And this man was suffering from depression. And one day he was sitting on the banks of the river. Then another sage came there. His name was Narada. He asked him, "What's the matter with you? You should be the happiest man in the world if somebody judges you in terms of what you have accomplished. Even among your disciples, there are great men, great authors and philosophers. So there is no reason for you to be unhappy." But he was found to be unhappy. So Narada asked him, "What's the matter?" He said, "Somehow, I'm not very happy." Then Narada told him, "You have written all these wonderful books. And the biggest book that he wrote was Mahabharata, which I mentioned. It is several times as big as Homer's and Virgil's works combined together, the oldest Greek and oldest Latin classics combined together. Vyasa's one book is several times as big as this. Hundreds of characters, thousands of dialogues, dynasties. So you find he was the greatest author of his days, and he was unhappy. So Narada told him, "You wrote all these wonderful things, that's fine. But did you write a single word? Did you write anything by reading which an average common man in the world will get peace of mind?" No. No, because he wrote these books, but they were great books, no doubt, but the approach is indirect. He wrote about dharma. Dharma in the Mahabharata is, every person has his own concept of dharma. This is so neutral. Did you write something which has a direct effect by following which a devotee of God will be prompted to pray, meditate, and do spiritual practices? He said no. So Narada taught him the story of Lord Krishna and his incarnation, and Vyasa wrote Bhagavata Purana, which contains 18,000 verses, according to some of the other versions, 24,000 verses. So he began his book with a statement, some great philosophical statements, and he ended with the great philosophical statements. But in the book, he narrated the story of Lord Krishna. And the book contains some very, very powerful and very direct instructions, which actually will help us to evolve a kind of spiritual philosophy, not only to those who believe in Hinduism or even in God, to any person who wants to live a happy life in this world, a happy and contented life in this world, will get this unique philosophy from this book. And once he wrote the last word of the book, Satyam Param Dhimahi, that's how the book ends. When he finished that last word, he felt an inner serenity and contentment in his heart. So when he did something that helped some people somewhere in the world, he became happy. So if you can do something in a way that helps somebody else, you may not be able to help everyone around you. You may not be able to analyze whether your actions are going to produce good or bad results to anyone in the world, but with the full conviction that this is the best way I can do. This is my way of spiritually justifying my existence by making a humble effort to do something which is not harmful to anyone, which will be, to my conviction, helpful to someone. This is dharma. When Vyasa did that, whether others got benefited or not, he felt a kind of inner fulfillment and contentment. But actually others got benefited. Even now, that is the most respected and revered devotional classic, read with the same reverence with which Vedas are read all over India and among the devotional philosophers, devotional practitioners of India. So if we do something that somehow helps others, it helps us, not in a very selfish way, because it gives us the feeling I have done something that is fulfilling, that gives a feeling of inner contentment and inner fulfillment. That's called kritagrityada. Well, I have done what I ought to have done, and I have achieved what I ought to have tried to achieve. That feeling actually, it has a great healing effect on the mind. Without that, modern man will not be able to live happily in this world. Because every tool of science and technology can be used for destroying the world several times over. Every gift from nature, without this spiritual common sense, can be a demon, can be a monster, a problem. So the spiritual common sense on the one hand can become a philosophy for the whole world. On the other hand, in our own individual pursuit of what we consider to be the most valuable thing to be achieved, this can become a great guide and moral help. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.